This is going to be a response to a YouTuber named the Metatron. If you haven't checked out his video, I highly recommend it because they're really interesting stuff, linked down below. He's got a lot of stuff on history and languages, and he studied both Chinese and Japanese history and languages very much in depth. So I personally appreciate that. Now, a video I just watched just now, I wanted to respond to. It's sort of a philosophical one, and it's called "Is War Ever Just?" So he talks about in a video where he addresses why he glorifies warriors, because he has a lot of videos on weapons and medieval battles and how people were like back then. And I think he owns like swords and armor and all that cool stuff. So he talks about why he glorifies them, even though obviously war brings on many bad things. And what he said was basically, well, there are times when war is justified. And those are times when you need to protect those you love, and also certain, let's say, righteous ideals such as freedom, right? You fight for freedom. Everybody likes that. And a paragon of the type of the do-gooder warriors are the types that he glorifies, and he remembers and he honors. I just want to address a few things about this. First and foremost, when we start talking about justice and morality, we know that it's relative. And by this, I don't mean how, theologians would interpret it as. A theologian would say, oh, relative, you mean like killing a person is just the same as accidentally elbowing someone? What I mean by relative is that it's relative to the situation, and there are plenty of times where you set a set of principles, you have to compromise in order to fit a specific set of needs for a specific context and situation. So morality and justice is driven by consequentialism. So, or what gives the best outcome. And what determines the best outcome is based on a few things we know to be as objectively true as we're able to determine what is objectively true versus the subjective. So, for example, it is objectively true that vast majority of the people on Earth want to live a long and prosperous life. In order to achieve those two things, there are a few conditions, such as maximizing happiness. And in order to do that, we have to be able to find meaning in life and commit to our passions, be able to do whatever we want, etc. At this point, we know that war generally will come between these things. War detriments progress, unless you systematically keep yourself on the winning side. And if you are, generally speaking, you won't be on the winning side for long. And once you go full stop, you then have to start answering for your crimes, because in order to keep being on the winning side, you would have to eventually resort to doing some pretty horrible things. That's why we know at this point that collaborating and having sort of a libertarian competition is much better than open violent conflicts, because conflicts would tend to bite you back on the ass. However, because we human beings have this innate desire to, win in the best way possible, we are pretty aggressive. Not necessarily as aggressive as other species, but still, both men and women have much aggressions within us. Different ways on the average. But in order to win in the best way possible, we still like violent things. In fact, one of my former professors who actually studied films that contain sex versus violence, he found that actually sex doesn't either sell or impress. However, violence does enormously. So most of us on the average get much more thrilled by violence than by even sex. So that's why Marvel movies, for example, are selling so well, and that's why violent video games are selling so well also, particularly among the males. But as we have evolved morality, we must reconcile our innate aggression, our innate desire to win, with aggression. And of course, this would be a evolving gradual process. But what we do is resort to putting ourselves in fantasies of a world which is black and white. I mean, we don't like gray areas. I mean, even Jesus didn't, right? So we came up with these paragons, as Metatron puts it, the type of aggressors who commits acts of aggression for the quote-unquote right reasons. And the imagined opponent will, of course, always be the blacker, the one who is much, 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 much more in the wrong. He or she who is evil. Basically, we call these people evil. And then we fight against that. And we want to think that our past wars in the same way. We want to think that, for example, the Nazis are pure evil and anybody who fought against them are the heroes. When in reality, things are much, much more nuanced and grayer than that. There were many Germans who either joined the Nazi Party or fought in Hitler's army who were actually upright people. We don't know how many of these people are actually upright because history is written by the winning side. We also don't know what would have actually happened had Hitler won. Some people say, well, the Jews and anybody who is an Aryan will be essentially fucked. Other people actually propose that if Hitler knew with as much confidence as he can gather that he is actually going to win and establish the Third Reich, more Jews than not would actually be spared and just kicked out. And it's the fact that he realized that he's going to lose. That's why he got desperate and wanted to finish what he started, etc. I know this is a wild hypothesis, but there are some arguments made against that. That's interesting. And even if most of Europe was conquered by Germany, generations after, we might reap some benefits from it. We don't know. That's the point. But we don't want to think about those possibilities. We want to think anybody who fought Hitler's army is just a hero because he fought for my country's freedom. End of story. And that is the fantasy. Once again, there is absolutely nothing wrong with fantasy. I mean, I have my head in the clouds all the time. It's like a coping mechanism. And I think it feeds your brain lots of dopamines, which would help with depression. But it is also a way of keeping your ideals and your principles in a certain part of your brain world, so to speak. You want to imagine, you want to think about an archetype of a perfect being. And from that being, you derive your principles. And then you attempt to live by those principles. That, in my opinion, is really what's happening when the Metatron glorifies these warrior paragons. The obstacle would be this cruel thing called reality, which is full of more possibilities than we can handle on a day-to-day basis, and it's more colorful than we will want to appreciate. The reality is, once you become a real warrior, vast majority of the time, once you understand the full scope of the situation, it cannot be justified to kill if we use the fundamental basis for our derived morality, which is empathy, because when you feel the necessity to take a life, more often than not, the person whose life you took also feels the same amount of necessity, if not more. We know that people become violent mostly from being raised in a violent environment, and even the most evilest psychopath, we know that they probably can't help it because they are, for lack of a better word, sick or mentally ill. So basically, we then realize that if we were being put into those situations, this is where empathy comes in, who is our opponent and how do we feel about doing the right and wrong things would be flipped. When you feel that you are the paragon to fight the one who is going to kill you or your family, that person is probably thinking the same thing. The noble who is fighting for his lord, which would be the most universal honor code in practically all societies during the feudalist societies, his lord might be the one who say, these people are the savages or they are the infidels or not. You must go and kill them. Once you do, you bring yourself and your family great honor. And you do it. So when you describe that situation that you described, Metatron, it seems to be very black and white. You are the innocent one and the person who comes down on you is the evil one, but in reality, it's much more nuanced. And once you pick up that sword and kill that person, you don't know what you have done. You might have killed a knight who is a hero among his own people, who spent his life serving his people. You might have killed a psychopath who can't help what he is. That's why you can't justify it. It's a necessity in that situation for you and you only. But you cannot declare right or wrong in the act itself. That's why we don't torture. That's why, Europe doesn't have the death penalty anymore. And even in US, where it still does, there are mountains of legal procedures on appeals. Because we know that while it's better if some people are not born, killing cannot actually be justified if we follow the principle of human empathy, which is literally the only objective guidance we can use to derive any ethical principle. But I want to mention that personally, I understand this feeling that you have, Metatron. You want to honor a warrior paragon just as I want to honor a thinker paragon. I want to live my life and think on the correct methodologies. I want to set principles for myself and live by it. And that generally happens much, much, much more often in my fantasies than in real life. I mean, this is unfortunate, but this is true. In real life, you have to make compromises, just like having the necessities of war, even when we know it's not right. Because no one can truly live based on a real ethical principle all the time. You either go to a mountain away from human civilization and live the life of a monk, which is what many people do, or you essentially slowly commit suicide. There is no other way. I know this because I'm going down this path right now and I don't know where it's going to lead me. And this is because we are social animals and we depend heavily on each other to live a human life of happiness and of pleasure. Once you start to trade your happiness and your pleasure for your principles over a certain threshold, you are going down the path of suicide. That's it. That's why these ideals can only exist in your fantasy. Reality is imperfect, as you say, but the bottom line is, if you were truly to become a warrior paragon and stick to those principles, you're going to see it's going to be a path of suicide. I mean, but hey, maybe you're willing to choose that and be content with it, but you will end up affecting very little in the world. I mean, this is the most likely case, and damage yourself greatly. So whether that's worth it or not will be up to you. Anyways, that's my depressing 2 cents. I look forward to watching more of your videos.